In the autumn of 1873, something collapsed that had never been supposed to collapse. The Vienna Stock Exchange buckled first, then Frankfurt, then London, then New York, in a cascade so perfectly timed that historians still argue about what actually caused it. They call it the Panic of 1873. They say it was railroad speculation. They say it was silver demonetization. They say it was the natural correction of an overextended credit system. What they don't say, what has never appeared in any official account, is what was discovered beneath the City of London in the months immediately following that collapse, and what was done with it. The Rothschild family had operated a vault system beneath New Court in the City of London since the early 1800s. This was not a secret. Banking families of sufficient wealth maintained private vaults beneath their premises as a matter of routine. What was not routine, what has only surfaced in fragments of private correspondence, in a single misrouted ledger entry from 1874, and in the testimony of a Prussian architect who left London suddenly in the winter of 1823 and never returned, was what the renovation crews found when they began expanding the vault network in September of that year. The expansion project had begun 3 months before the crash. It was not a response to the crash, it had been planned. The crews were brought in from the continent, not English labourers, which was itself unusual, and they were working below the existing vault floor, drilling into what the architectural records describe only as pre-existing subterranean infrastructure of uncertain origin. That phrase, uncertain origin, in a document otherwise filled with precise Victorian engineering language. Someone knew how strange that phrase was, and they wrote it anyway, because they had no other words for what they were looking at. What the Prussian architect, a man named Heinrich Voss, whose name appears in exactly 3 surviving documents and then vanishes from the historical record entirely, described in a letter to his brother in Dusseldorf was a chamber, not a cellar, not a forgotten medieval storage room, a chamber with walls of a material he could not identify, smoothed to a finish that he said no Victorian tool could replicate, carved with symbols he had never encountered in any of his architectural training. He described the scale as enormous. He described the acoustics as wrong. Sound behaved differently inside the chamber than it should have, and he described what was inside it. In a separate fragment, believed to be from the same letter but separated before the copy was made, Voss wrote that the symbols carved into the walls were not decorative. They followed a logical sequence, repeating at intervals that suggested a system, a grammar, a map of something he could not determine. He wrote that he had spent 3 nights copying them into a personal notebook. He wrote that the notebook was subsequently taken from his lodgings before he could post it. This is where the record fractures. Voss's letter to his brother was intercepted. We know this because a partial copy of it exists in the private archive of a German banking family whose descendants donated papers to a Frankfurt historical society in 1961. And a researcher who examined those papers in 1987 found the copy filed between 2 unrelated documents, as if placed there hastily. The copy is incomplete. It breaks off mid-sentence. What survives describes an inventory. Maps, instruments, bound volumes in a script that Voss said bore no resemblance to any written system he had ever studied, and objects he struggled to name. He used the word apparatus repeatedly. He used the phrase, not of this construction era, 4 times in the surviving fragment. The letter ends with the words, they are sealing it again, and I have been told. And then nothing. Voss left London within 6 weeks. His name does not appear in any subsequent architectural commission in Europe. His brother's reply, if there was one, has never surfaced. What has surfaced, in a single customs entry from the port of Hamburg, dated February 1874, is a record of a man matching Voss's description arriving with no declared profession and no declared destination. The entry is initialed by the customs officer and then crossed out. No reason is given for the cancellation. The panic of 1873 broke over the markets in May of that year. The Rothschild vault expansion, which had begun in September of the previous year, was completed, or rather halted, by the end of 1873. The records of the expansion project were classified internally. This was not unusual for private banking families. What was unusual was the instruction that went out to every member of the vault crew, a non-disclosure covenant written in 3 languages, requiring silence not merely about the construction details, but about any discoveries ancillary to the primary works. That specific phrase. Ancillary discoveries in a construction non-disclosure covenant for a banking vault expansion. Of the 14 continental workers identified by name in the project's payroll ledger, 11 left England within 4 months of the project's halt. 2 reappear in subsequent records under different names in different countries. The 14th has his name crossed out in the ledger with no explanation offered. To understand why any of this matters, you have to understand what the Tartaria question actually is. Grand Tartary, Tartaria, appeared on European maps from the 1500s through the late 1700s as a vast civilization occupying most of Central and Northern Asia and portions of what is now Eastern Europe. The 1771 Encyclopaedia Britannica devoted a substantial entry to it. It was described as a real geopolitical entity, with cities, infrastructure, a population, a system of governance. And then, across roughly 100 years, it disappeared, not just as a political entity, but from the map of human memory so completely that by the mid-1800s, educated Europeans spoke of the region as if it had always been wilderness. That erasure has never been satisfactorily explained. Civilizations collapse. They are conquered. But they don't vanish from historiography this completely, unless the record was the object of an active, sustained, and extraordinarily well-resourced effort at suppression. The 1851 census of London recorded a population engaged in a massive construction and demolition program that historians have never fully accounted for. Thousands of buildings were demolished in the 1840s and 1850s, structures of unusual scale, with foundations far deeper than their apparent age should have required. A demolition supervisor named James Craddock left a private journal describing the foundations of a demolished building in Bishopsgate as going down to a depth inconsistent with the building above and lined with stonework of a type he had never encountered. He attributed it to Roman construction. This attribution was accepted because it foreclosed further inquiry. The Rothschilds were not passive observers of 19th century European history. They were its financial architects. The House of Rothschild had funded the Napoleonic War, all sides simultaneously. They had financed the British government's purchase of the Suez Canal. They had restructured the debt of multiple European states after multiple wars. They operated at a level where history was not something that happened to them. It was something they shaped. When a family at that level of access begins sealing chambers beneath London and binding construction crews to silence about ancillary discoveries, the question of what they found does not remain merely architectural. The 1873 crash itself deserves more scrutiny than it receives. What it actually accomplished was the consolidation of enormous amounts of European and American capital into a smaller number of hands over the subsequent 5-year depression. Businesses failed, banks failed, smaller financial houses failed. The houses that did not fail, that were positioned to absorb assets at catastrophic discounts, were the large private banking families. The Rothschilds did not merely survive the panic of 1873, they grew. The question of whether a panic of that scale can be deliberately initiated is not a fringe question. It has been asked by credentialed economists. What adds a layer is the timing. The vault expansion began before the crash. The sealing of the chamber appears to have been completed during the crash, when the attention of every financial journalist and government official in Europe was directed elsewhere. The sealed section of the Rothschild vault network appears, in the fragmentary record, to have remained sealed and undisturbed for 40 years. In 1914, the world went to war. The sequence of events in the summer of 1914, The assassination, the ultimatums, the mobilizations moved with a speed that contemporary observers found almost mechanically precise. The war required financing on a scale that had never previously been attempted. That financing came from the private banking sector, and in the first 6 months of 1914, before the outbreak of hostilities, there was a series of movements within the Rothschild vault network at New Court that appear in a single internal logistics document that surfaced in a 2009 sale of private papers at a small London auction house, purchased by a private collector and photographed before its current whereabouts became unclear. The document, which the collector described in a brief online post that has since been deleted but was archived, referenced the transfer of materials from the lower archive, as per the arrangement of 1873, to the secondary facility at location redacted in the archived copy, prior to the commencement of anticipated disruptions. The phrase, as per the arrangement of 1873, is what matters. It means the sealing in 1873 was not a permanent burial. It was a storage decision. The materials inside the chamber were preserved, not destroyed. They were moved out in 1914, before the war, to somewhere that the document does not name. What were those materials? The Tartaria researchers, who have spent years working in the margins of acceptable history, have proposed a consistent set of objects and documents that would explain both the scale of the suppression and the institutional effort required to maintain it. Cartographic records showing a coherent global civilization predating the one we are taught. Technical documentation, engineering or architectural knowledge that would reveal infrastructure capabilities inconsistent with the accepted timeline of human development. Astronomical records from a civilization whose understanding exceeded what we are told was possible for the era. Linguistic records that would connect Tartarian script, the symbols Voss described as unlike any system he had studied, to a broader pre-catastrophe global language. Any one of these surfacing publicly would require a complete reconstruction of the history that was built in the 19th century and maintained ever since. The mud flood. This is the phenomenon that sits at the center of the Tartaria question, and that mainstream historians handle with a particular kind of careful dismissal. Buildings across Europe and North America from the 18th and early 19th centuries show a consistent pattern. Their ground floors are buried. Windows that should be at street level are half submerged. Doorways lead down. Basement levels contain architectural features, ornamental columns, decorative stonework, proportioned fenestration that no builder would put in a basement. They are ground floor features that became basements when something covered them. The conventional explanation is gradual silting, urban fill. But the scale is wrong. The consistency across geographically distant locations is wrong, and the timeline is wrong. The burial appears to have happened rapidly across a specific period, not gradually over centuries. In Odessa, in Strasbourg, in Philadelphia, in Edinburgh, cities with no shared geology or construction tradition, the pattern holds. Street-level windows now function as basement lights. Ornate arched entryways open into storage rooms below the pavement. The fill material in many excavations is not accumulated debris. It is sediment, uniform, horizontal, undisturbed, as if water carrying enormous quantities of particulate matter moved across vast distances and then simply stopped. What the Tartaria researchers propose is a catastrophic event, a reset, that wiped out or severely disrupted an advanced global civilization sometime in the late 1700s or early 1800s, leaving infrastructure standing but populations decimated, and creating the conditions for a new historical narrative to be constructed over the ruins. The 19th century on this reading is not a century of progress from primitive origins. It is a century of recovery and concealment, in which the surviving power structures, the banking families, the colonial empires, the newly formed academic institutions, work to bury the evidence of what came before and replace it with a story of human history that began at the beginning rather than after a catastrophe. The Rothschild vaults fit into this framework with a specificity that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. A banking family with the resources to intercept letters, bind workers to silence, manage the timing of economic crises, and move materials from a sealed chamber 40 years after sealing it, in the weeks before a war that would reshape the political map of Europe, is exactly the kind of actor you would expect at the centre of that kind of suppression. Where did the materials go in 1914? The secondary facility named in the logistics document was redacted in the archived copy. The collector who purchased the document has not resurfaced publicly. The document itself has not been independently verified, which is precisely the condition you would expect if its chain of custody had been managed. But the chamber beneath New Court, or what was beneath New Court before the building was rebuilt, is gone. New Court was demolished in 1962. A new building was constructed. The entire underground infrastructure was redesigned. If there was a chamber with walls of a material Heinrich Voss could not name and symbols he could not read, it is not there now. Whatever was in it left in 1914. What replaced it is a modern bank building in the City of London, sitting on foundations that no one has examined independently, in a square mile that has its own police force, its own governance structures, and its own centuries-long tradition of not answering questions it does not wish to answer. The Panic of 1873 is a footnote in economic history. Heinrich Voss is not in any history. The chamber is not in any official record. The 1914 transfer document is in private hands, or is lost, or was never meant to surface at all. And the civilization that built structures with walls of unidentifiable material and carved them with symbols no trained 19th century European architect could read. That civilization has been assigned no place in the history we are taught. It has been given the name Tartaria by the people who refuse to stop asking about it. Because it needed a name, because something that large and that systematically erased deserved at least that much. What they found beneath London in 1873 was sealed for 40 years. It was moved in 1914. And the story that was built over it has held for more than a century. The question is not whether that story is incomplete. The question is what it would cost, or for whom, and in what way, for it to finally be finished.